Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second in our November SEN Legal webinar series. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this evening by Melinda Erickson. Melinda is a highly specialist paediatric occupational therapist, which we have the privilege with working with in our tribunal appeals all the time. Extremely knowledgeable lady, very, very helpful, and the information she gives is very clear. So I'm hoping that it will be really useful for all of you out there tonight. Melinda is the first of our expert speakers this month. So we are bringing you a webinar every Tuesday and every Thursday throughout November. Every Tuesday, you'll be joined by one of the legal team here at SEN Legal, who are going to be delivering presentations based on the questions which you post to us following our really successful January webinar series. And then every Thursday, you're going to be joined by an expert in the field of special educational needs, who is hopefully answering some of the many, many questions that you've posted to our social media channels. So I don't want to waste too much of this webinar time slot gabbling on, so I'm going to hand over now to Melinda, who is going to be talking to you today all about sensory integration and processing. So over to you, Melinda.
Hi, thanks very much, Nicole. As Nicole said, I'm a highly specialist paediatric OT, and I specialise in working with children, mainly within schools, and also doing expert witness assessments for SENDIS tribunals. So one of the very big questions on all parents' minds is sensory integration. What is it and how does it affect children? And what can they do to help their child, or what can they tell the school to help their children function a little easier within the school environment? So I've got a presentation that is going to be shared on the screen. And what I want to try and do is provide a little bit of background about what sensory integration, or SI, is, the different sensory systems, and also some strategies that parents can try. But I think one of the most important things, and I will probably say this a number of times, is you can't just be given a whole outline of strategies or activities or things that you can do without knowing exactly what's going on in your child's sensory system. And in order to know that, you really do need to have a specialist do an assessment. So we'll start off with a little bit about what is SI. And sensory integration, to me, really is just a very natural process that takes place within the womb while the child is developing and all through our life. So whether we have difficulties with it or not, we all process sensory information. It's a neurological process, and it's the taking in of sensory information and the organization of that sensory information within the brain, and the response of the body or the brain to the sensory information. Okay, so when we're talking about sensory integration, like I said, it's actually the intake of information into the brain and the organization or the modulation of sensory information. This takes place within the midbrain, within a place called mainly the amygdala, and it sends the sensory messages to the right part of the brain. If it's working effectively, it will block out the information going that the brain doesn't need to respond to at that point in time. So that could be something like sitting in a classroom and being able to attend to the teacher's voice, and then blocking out the fan, or children speaking in the background, or children playing outside the window. So sensory processing as a disorder is actually a condition that exists when sensory signals are not being organized correctly in the brain. The body's not able to understand the information that's coming in, to organize the information, or to respond to the information appropriately. It was identified as a processing disorder by an occupational therapist called Dr. Jean Ayres. And she did a lot of research on how sensory integration influences behaviour, how it affects children's learning within their school environment, how it impacts on movement, coordination, body awareness, and how it interferes with children's relationships and social skills. We know that sensory processing difficulties can affect children in all settings, within the home, within the community, and within school. About a number of years ago, there were many occupational therapists who were trying to get sensory processing disorder as itself accepted into the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was version 5, the DSM-5. Unfortunately, sensory processing disorder itself didn't actually make it into the DSM-5, but it is now part of the diagnostic criteria for autism. It's children with autism or adults with autism may or may not have sensory integration difficulties, but research has shown that about 80% of the autistic population are affected by sensory difficulties. So we're going to look at all the different senses, and there's some that you may have heard of and some that might be unfamiliar to you. We have the common 5 senses, which is taste, smell, touch, hearing, and vision, and we're probably all quite aware of those. There's 2 other senses that are probably quite well known to parents who have children with difficulties, and one is the sense of movement and balance, and that is the vestibular system, and proprioception, which really is where is your body in space. There's an 8th sensory system that we have known about for quite a number of years, but it's now beginning to become much more well known outside of therapeutic circles, and this is interoception. So knowing what is happening inside of your body, your awareness of your own physiological and emotional state. It's being able to understand things like hunger or thirst or temperature regulation, and it really impacts on our emotional connection to the body. So knowing that you are feeling nervous when you have butterflies in your stomach is interoception. Some children might perceive this as actually being sick. And I'm talking about children, but obviously it affects adults as well. But I focus on paediatrics in my practice, so I'm just going to speak about children today. Go on to the next slide. So when you're feeling a certain way, your body tells you. We've got receptors all throughout the body, inside all of the organs, within muscle fibers, within the connections between the bones. You need to know how you're feeling in order to have an appropriate emotional response. And occupational therapists have been doing a lot of research. This is mainly in the States, more so than in the UK, but understanding how interoception is related to sensory processing and how it impacts on children's emotional regulation and emotional responses. So, like I was saying, when you have difficulties with interoception, it can impact significantly on your ability to communicate your needs and to tell your teacher that actually you're feeling hungry, you're not feeling angry, or you're very sudden and it appears to be a very irrational response to something is actually because you're really struggling to understand what is happening within your body. It is becoming more and more well known, and some teachers are becoming aware of it, that sensory overload or autistic meltdowns are actually very strongly related to overload of sensory information and inability to perceive your own interoception. A lot of parents describe their children as or their experience of their children at home as feeling like they're walking on eggshells because they don't know when there's going to be a meltdown. Intraoception impacts on so many different areas. Self-awareness, which is what I've mainly been speaking about, problem solving, knowing what you need to do to help yourself achieve a more regulated state, perspective taking, understanding other people's feelings, social understanding, flexible thinking, intuition, and very big one, emotional regulation. So interoception, it certainly can be helped. There's a very cognitive approach using things like mindfulness, relaxation strategies, meditation, helping children and especially teenagers to understand how they feel and to be able to pay more attention to their body signals and linking those body signals to their emotions. We all know what it feels like when you're hungry and hangry, the combination of being hungry and angry. But usually when you have that interoceptive ability, you know, I'm feeling really hungry or I'm feeling really tired. I need to do something about this. When you don't have that link, then your difficulties can become far more significant. Using sensory input like vestibular movement, whether it be someone who needs some more aggressive vestibular input or someone who needs a lot of calming vestibular input, using proprioception, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, or using tactile input also can help interoception. So they're all very strongly interrelated. We can't look at one sensory system in isolation. They are all related together. One of the sensory systems that impact most significantly is the tactile system. We've got two lines of information, or two ways that we receive tactile information. One is the protective system and one is the discriminative system. So we're going to talk about the protective system first. This is a very primal sensory system. It has existed through evolution. It's a protective system, so it activates our fight or flight system. Things like light touch, pain, temperature will trigger us to have a response. So move away from something that is irritating me, or feeling certain types of pain. You will take your finger away if you're touching something hot. This is an automatic response. It's not a cognitive response. And this is very often when we see children having what appears to be an aggressive outburst. It always happens when they're lining up, or it always happens in the swimming pool. It's very often the response of just having that light touch continually against you, building up and building up. And some children actually perceive that as threatening and will turn around and push a child away or even hit a child because they haven't perceived that information in a regulated manner. They've perceived it as threatening and responded in a fight or flight manner. The discriminative system, this is what allows us to engage in a lot of fine motor activities, being able to manipulate tools, being able to understand whether you're touching something that's rough or fuzzy. It is a system that can be used to calm and organize. And if we use it correctly, if in therapy, then we see a lot of really strong benefits. Children use it themselves to calm and organize. So you might have that child who is always fiddling with something, always needs to have a pen in their hand or a piece of blue tack, always touching everything on the table, which can seem very distracting, but actually they may not be aware of it, but they're using this discriminative tactile system to organize their sensory system. When we have dysfunction of the tactile system, we see children who are incredibly easily distracted. They can present as being very hyperactive. We can have over or under sensitivity when we're looking at the tactile system. And the oversensitivity is really when we're looking at that fight or flight type reaction. So children who are really hypervigilant, who refuse to get their hands dirty, who find certain clothing textures or tags in their clothing incredibly irritating, and they just can't concentrate. But sometimes these children can't actually tell us, or they can't register themselves that that is why they're irritated. They can be very disorganized. They can find touch very disorganizing, and we can find difficulties in eating. So the oral tactile system can be hypersensitive. Children who eat a very limited range of foods. The children who seem to have a very brown diet, they'll only eat things like pasta or bread, things that they know how they're going to feel in their mouth and how they're going to taste. If you give a child a certain brand of cracker every single time, they know what they're getting. However, something like a blueberry or a strawberry or a raspberry, they can taste different every time. They can feel different every time. Sometimes they're squishy. Sometimes they taste quite tart. Sometimes they taste very mushy in your mouth. So this is where we see children having very picky diets. And often children who need to wear glasses or hearing aids, when they have tactile sensitivity, it can cause a lot of difficulty for them because they just can't bear the feeling of them on their skin or on their face. I was speaking a little bit earlier about difficulties for children lining up. So they could either be hypersensitive and respond in a very protective manner, but they can also be actually very tactile with other children, seeing them touching other children, standing too close because they have an undersensitive sensory system and they don't realize that personal space is just far too close. There's a lot of time I see kids sitting in class and they can't stop playing with the hair of the child in front of them or touching the child in front of them. And that other child getting really irritated by that, but they've got no idea that they're even doing it half the time. Sometimes children can become incredibly inflexible or rigid, things are very frightening to them if they don't know what's about to happen. I spoke about having clothing difficulties, sensitivity to different textures, and that can also lead to sensitivity to hair brushing or teeth brushing or nail clipping. And the last point there, just talking about the fight or flight reaction, seeing excessive meltdowns, hitting, even kicking other children because they've responded in a very protective manner. You may have heard the term tactile defensiveness, and this is really what I'm talking about with the sensitivity to light touch, the difficulty organizing themselves, their behavior and their concentration becoming very impacted by this and affecting their learning within a classroom, and the fight or flight response being incredibly aggressive or responding in a fight or flight manner when they feel threatened or stressed. So the interventions for tactile defensiveness, there's so many different interventions that can be used with children. But again, it's really important to have a trained therapist do an assessment and talk to you about what is happening within your child's sensory system and what kind of input they actually need. I did want to just mention the brushing protocol because there's a lot of talk about this, and it's something that parents ask me about very often. This protocol was developed quite a number of years ago. There's a lot of research that says it doesn't work. There's a lot of more so single case studies that show it does work. So it's really difficult to get a random controlled study with a lot of individuals because everybody's sensory system is different. I've found the Wilbarger brushing protocol to be incredibly effective with some children. I have heard of children who've had negative reactions to it as well. And it's, if you haven't heard of it, it's using a surgical brush to brush over certain parts of the body in a certain sequence, but it also has to be followed by joint compression. So if these sorts of things are being recommended to you by other parents or you're reading about it on the internet, it's really important to speak to someone who's trained, because there, like I said, there are children who've had negative reactions to it. So there needs to be a really thorough assessment, and the people who are implementing the brushing need to be trained by someone who is qualified. So another sensory system, that is proprioception. Proprioception is understanding the position of your body in space. It really does determine how we interact with the environment, because if we're walking along a hallway at school and there's other children coming up towards us, then we need to be aware of how much space I leave between myself and another child. Just walking through a doorway, many children who have a really poor awareness of their body will quite literally bump into the doorway. I've seen children try to fit their body between gaps between two desks that are 5 or 10 centimeters, and they just don't seem to understand that their body is so much bigger than that gap. This leads to them bumping the table, knocking supplies over, trying to walk through kids seated on the carpet, just having no idea where their foot is going to land. Having that awareness of your body in space, or that lack of awareness, very often these are the children who accidentally hurt other children or their siblings, who are too rough when they're playing, and they just don't understand the force or how to regulate their force. The children who break things all the time, perhaps break the tip of a pencil all the time, break their toys all the time, break other people's toys all the time. It can be really stressful for the children and also for the parents, because they're really unaware of how much force to use, and it's time after time just hurting somebody accidentally, and it really starts to have a big impact on their self-confidence. So the proprioceptive system is, the receptors for this are located within the muscles, the tendons, and the joints. So every single joint of our body has these receptors that tell the brain where your body is in space. And this allows you to be able to do things like, I can close my eyes and I can move my fingers, and I know exactly what they're doing. I can hold up however many fingers you tell me to, because I can feel that information. It's being transferred back to my brain. Children who have really poor awareness perhaps cannot do these sorts of movements, but maybe they can if they're watching, but as soon as you ask them to close their eyes, they just completely lose it. Things like we get children to touch their nose and close their eyes. Things like that will tell us how aware they are of where their body is in space. Then when children have difficulties within their proprioceptive system, they're generally the kids who, like I said, bump into people all the time, accidentally hurt people all the time. They're clumsy children. They have a lot of difficulty learning new skills. They might present with odd postures. They might have difficulty doing buttons up, especially ones that they actually can't see, connecting the zipper together on a jacket. They might present as really disorganized. They just can't seem to organize themselves and their belongings. Their desk is always cluttered, or they knock things off the desk because they just don't even realize their hand's right next to the pencil pot. We often have a lot of children who have difficulties with handwriting. You really can't look at your hand as you're writing. So you need to have quite good proprioceptive feedback in order to know how your hands are moving. A lot of kids with proprioceptive difficulties are very messy after they eat, and they don't even seem to be aware that they've got food on their clothes or food on their face. And again, this impacts socially for kids when they look really messy. And they very often have difficulty learning the new motor movements, as I was talking about with clumsiness. They might not want to engage in PE. They might not want to go out in the playground because they have so much difficulty learning new skills. Very often children with developmental coordination disorder, or also known as dyspraxia, have difficulties with proprioception. So things that can help with proprioceptive awareness is heavy movement. So things like jumping. Now, jumping, a lot of kids with proprioceptive difficulties have difficulty with jumping. A trampoline, a trampette can be really good just to help them, but a floor and jumping on a floor is going to be even better, because that's going to provide you with a harder reinforcement of your body in space. Asking children to stack chairs can be a really good one in school. That's giving them a lot of proprioceptive feedback. For older children, things like going to the gym or doing weightlifting, having a bungee cord on chairs. So it's usually a TheraBand tied between the legs of the chair, so their feet can actually bounce on that while they're working. A lot of schools will allow children to use chewing gum. A lot won't, but schools who understand these types of difficulties, having chewing gum helps to provide that deep proprioceptive input through the jaw. Around our jaw and our face, we have a huge number of receptors, tactile receptors, and also proprioceptive receptors. So you might find kids chewing on their pencils in class, chewing on their clothing. This is related to proprioceptive seeking. Now, it might arise from things like anxiety, but the chewing is actually providing calming input. So when we've got the kids who literally chew holes through their clothing or chew the end off their pencil, these kids really are trying to give themselves proprioceptive feedback. I've got pretzel hugs on there, also known as hot dog rolls, or making a pizza, but you're rolling children up in a mat, using bean bags or bowls to provide really deep proprioceptive input onto their bodies, rolling them up really tightly in blankets. All of these sort of strategies are really good for the proprioceptive system. So the next system is the vestibular system. Now, this is the receptors for the vestibular system are located within the inner ear in the semicircular canals. So when your head moves from side to side or forwards and backwards, there's fluid within the semicircular canals, and this tells you that your head is moving. Someone who is very undersensitive might actually fall and not put their hands out to save themselves because they're not receiving the information. People who are highly sensitive to vestibular input might absolutely hate their head being out of position. Even something like going up an escalator, stepping up a curb can be absolutely terrifying for children who are very sensitive to movement. The brain needs vestibular input to function. If we go back developmentally and look at how the development of children, you know, having children lying on their stomach, doing tummy time, encouraging parents to do tummy time, to strengthen the trunk muscles, to get the children lifting their head up. This starts to initiate the vestibular system, just carrying your children and moving around. All of this information builds upon a schema within the brain of understanding movement. The vestibular system is, it's a very, very strong system. We use it a lot in therapy, and actually it's incredible what the responses that you can see when you are using the vestibular system in the right way. So children who may be incredibly disorganized, say for me, if I'm doing an assessment of children's movement, and I can see that they're highly sensitive because they are doing the hopping and the skipping and the balancing, and they're just becoming incredibly dysregulated. I'll often take a break and use a swing or some type of suspension equipment and use linear movement of going back and forth. 9 times out of 10, it helps to calm the sensory system. It's really, really natural to me, this system. Whenever you have a baby, almost anyone who holds a baby starts rocking a baby back and forth. Whenever we need to calm a baby down, one of our first things to do is to rock it, or if they're in a buggy, to push the buggy back and forth. You know, this is just that linear movement that we all seem to revert to automatically when we're trying to calm babies. It's also actually with the proprioceptive system. So when you're holding a baby and you might be actually tapping it quite hard, that's also giving them that deep proprioceptive input. So all of the sensory systems and all of sensory integration, it's nothing new. It's been around throughout all of evolution. It really is what controls and dominates all of our responses to our environment. The vestibular system has a really strong impact on attention and concentration and postural regulation. So children who are not able to perceive it, or who are overly sensitive to it, often have a lot of difficulties with concentration and a lot of difficulties with postural regulation. Sitting upright, sitting still can often be really difficult for these kids. The types of difficulties I've already spoken about. Fearful reactions just to ordinary movement, kids who don't even want to try the climbing frame, who are petrified of being on a scooter, things that you sort of expect your kids are going to enjoy, it's going to be really fun, but actually they hate it. And these kids might always want their feet on the ground. So sitting perhaps on an exercise ball and their feet leaving the ground, sitting on a swing, they can become really petrified. They need to feel grounded. And these children need gentle experiences and support to develop it's not really their tolerance, but to help mature their processing of vestibular information. When kids who have difficulties, I have spoken about a number of these things, children who are undersensitive can start engaging in excessive movement. They can't sit still. They stand up when they're trying to write. They find every excuse in the book to go up and see the teacher. They're leaving the classroom all the time. They're bouncing off the walls, and they're just restless and always distractible. We see a lot of behaviors that can be quite concerning, or these risk-taking behaviors in children who are very undersensitive. So climbing to the top of a climbing frame or walking along the top of the monkey bars, these are the kids that other parents, and I had one of these myself, who are always petrified because they're at the top of the tree, but they really seek this movement. I've spoken about the postural regulation difficulties, excessive swinging and jumping that these kids engage in. We speak about children being seekers or under-responsive. And that's really just what I've been speaking about throughout the last few slides. So the seeker who is actively seeking this movement all the time. But what actually we need to be really aware of is the point of going over the top. So they might be engaging in risk-taking or excessive climbing or swinging at the park, but actually this can flip over to making them very dysregulated, and they might find it very, very difficult to come down. So this is why I'm always advocating that a therapist needs to assess your child. It's never a good idea for a therapist just to hand a list of activities to the school or to the parents, because they need to be implemented in a specific order, but also the people doing it need to have training to know at what point you stop, what to look out for. These kids love movement, they need movement, but actually there's a point when you need to be able to recognize the signs of becoming overstimulated. One of my pet peeves is these kids are often the ones that are quite disruptive in class, the ones who constantly get kept in, or they miss their break times because perhaps they need to finish work, or perhaps they're actually being punished. These are the kids who have to go out and do the movement and have their break time. So yeah, that's always a discussion I'm having with teaching staff, that keeping these kids in, keeping any child in actually at a break time is not a solution. So the movement, these kids need the movement to concentrate and to learn. Okay, so auditory processing is another sensory system, and it's probably one that people are more familiar with. And this is being able to receive auditory information, noise, verbal instructions, discriminate and filter the sound. When children have difficulties with auditory processing, we see them having difficulties remembering and sequencing skills, remembering the order that they're supposed to do a task, or to follow some actions that the teacher might be teaching. Brain gym type things might be difficult for children with auditory processing difficulties. Following directions or understanding instructions can be really difficult, especially if they're given a number of directions at one time. Isolating what you need to attend to first, and again, sequencing what you need to attend to first is really difficult. Attending in class, concentration, when you are hearing every noise within your environment at the same frequency, when you can't discriminate the teacher's voice from the tapping of a child's pen next to you. Had a little girl the other day who said just swishing of feet during an exam, someone swishing their feet next to them, it just completely takes their attention away, and they need to have exams within their own room, because every little piece of auditory information just puts them off the task. Children who have auditory processing difficulties very often have speech and language disorders. One big thing for me that I see all the time is children who cannot sequence L, M, N, O, P in the alphabet, because it's often a part of the alphabet that's said really fast, and they just don't hear every individual letter. And it's a big thing that triggers me to really look into their auditory processing as well. Auditory processing difficulties can be very frightening. They can lead to a lot of anxiety. They can stop a child being able to attend assemblies or being able to eat in the dining hall with their friends. It can impact, when children are sensitive to auditory information, it can really impact on family life. Things like going to soft play can lead to a meltdown every time. Birthday parties become an absolute nightmare. Going to a carnival, going to the movies, things that you envisage doing with your kids and perhaps the siblings enjoy it. You really need to start planning when you do the grocery shopping. If you have to take your child who has auditory processing or auditory sensitivity, difficulty understanding or differentiating between the WH questions, remembering what, where, why, and then linking it to the question that's been put to them. And when that's really difficult and you can see other kids doing it, it can really impact on your self-confidence and not wanting to answer any questions in class. Having difficulties listening to your peers on the playground, knowing what they're saying to you and responding appropriately, it can be really, really difficult when you can't isolate that information, or when you're so overwhelmed by everything around you. So it really can impact on relationships and social skills for children. Another area that parents are probably really familiar with, visual processing. So being able to identify and interpret what you're seeing, or all the visual information within your environment. Again, as with all the sensory systems, we have oversensitivity and undersensitivity as well. Some people are very sensitive to visual information. They're even something like a fluorescent light that flickers in a way that most people don't even notice can be something that they absolutely cannot even tolerate. Classrooms, teachers are always really keen to share children's work. I think it was really pushed quite a few years ago that having a visually stimulating environment was really good for learning. But actually, having a calm and ordered learning environment, especially for younger children, regardless of whether they have difficulties or not, helps children to attend and concentrate. I think it helps all children to attend and concentrate better. But for children who cannot isolate what they need to look at, who walk into an environment and see every single thing in the environment, and then the next day see that tiny little change that no other child has even noticed, these very stimulating environments can be really, really difficult for them. We see a lot of difficulties discriminating the foreground and background information. So again, that's the being able to isolate on your worksheet or on the interactive whiteboard what you need to look at, and blocking out all those other things that are not relevant to that one learning experience. A lot of children who have specific learning difficulties do show visual processing difficulties when I do assessments. Sometimes that's the trigger for me to refer on, because I'll see specific difficulties in certain areas of visual processing, and refer on to someone who is more qualified to look into specific learning difficulties. And children who have visual processing difficulties often have trouble reading nonverbal cues, so reading facial expressions. They might not know that somebody is cross. If a teacher's speaking to a child and perhaps got a gentle way and smiling, they don't understand that maybe what they're doing is wrong, because the information is not matching the nonverbal information is not matching the verbal information. Some children just don't perceive when somebody is upset, another child is upset, because they're not perceiving that visual information properly. So it can really have a significant impact on social relationships. We've spoken throughout all of the slides, we've been speaking about the different sensory systems and being over-responsive or under-responsive. Children can present with over-responsivity in one sensory system and under-responsivity in another. They can present with fluctuating thresholds, and they can change from day to day. So something that seemed to be really difficult one day, they might not even notice the next. It's a really complex area to try and get a accurate profile that doesn't change for your child. We talk about thresholds. All of us have a certain threshold for sensory information. So when we are processing sensory information in a neurotypical manner, there's a certain threshold, and we might need a bit more or a bit less depending if we're feeling tired or irritable or stressed. And it all goes up and down within just one certain continuum. Now, when you have very low thresholds, that continuum just the normal amount of information is too much for you to tolerate, because your thresholds are so low. Just getting a hair brushed or getting a haircut or having to wear certain textures is incredibly frightening and distressing for you. I spoke about the vestibular system having a very low threshold. When your feet leave the ground, things become really frightening for you. The pure act of bending down to pick something up will disorient you. And these are the kids that are avoiding movement. And the visual system, we were just speaking about, when you have very low thresholds, you have difficulty tolerating bright lights or visually stimulating environments. With the proprioceptive system, people who respond very quickly, they might not like people hugging them. They might have difficulty just moving their body. That stimulation, that reception happens so quickly for them. The auditory system, we see kids being fearful, being incredibly easily distracted, and frequently responding in protective mechanisms such as covering their ears or running away from a situation. I didn't speak about the oral system. It really is part of the tactile system, but picky eaters, being incredibly sensitive to certain textures and very selective about what you'll eat can be a huge problem for many children. And then things like brushing your teeth, having anything in your mouth can make them feel incredibly disoriented. When we speak about sensory under responsivity, we're looking at a brain whose thresholds are up here. So it takes a huge amount of input to trigger a response. These are the kids who just don't seem to notice touch, don't seem to notice that they're touching everybody else. They're dressed inappropriately for the weather. So this is very interrelated with Intraoception. Kids who just wear shorts through the whole of winter, who don't seem to register the temperature or won't wear a coat. I mean, we also get kids who are overly sensitive who won't wear coats as well. So it's, again, really important to have a full sensory assessment done by someone who is trained and experienced. The kids who have responsivity or very high thresholds to vestibular input are those who just don't get dizzy. They're always on the move. They're always upside down. They lie on the couch upside down. They just can't seem to sit upright. And with the visual sense, we've got the kids who can't find something. They just can't see stuff in a cluttered background. They're not the children who are seeing absolutely everything. They just miss what's right in front of them. The kids with really high thresholds for proprioceptive information, these are the kids who look like they're just clumsy all the time, poor body awareness. They're floppy, they have poor awareness of how they're sitting at a table, how they're holding their body. The children who are under-responsive to auditory information, they always want the TV turned up really loud. They talk really loudly. We do often see children with sensitivity actually engaging in really noisy behaviours as well. And that's because they're trying to control their own sensory environment. But then children who are under-responsive to auditory information will have a lot of noise around them because they're missing auditory information. We have the under-responses in the oral sense as well. And these are the kids who just seem to crave chili or really strong flavors, or things that are just unusual for children to like. They'll eat absolutely anything, but they'll crave more and more. Perhaps some kids like to chew on ice, or chew on carrots, or really crunchy foods. Kids who are sensory seekers or cravers, there might be terms that you've heard, they seek to arouse the nervous system. And these are the ones perhaps who enjoy bear hugs, but inappropriately. And it's a mixture, I would say, actually, between the tactile and the proprioceptive system, and the kids who are always craving to touch things. And again, the vestibular system, which we have spoken about, the kids who are always jumping around, always on the move. Within the proprioceptive sense, we've got the kids who are constantly crashing and bumping, who crave high physical activities, the auditory processing difficulties, who speak louder than necessary. Often they need that music in the background to be able to concentrate. And the oral seekers, who are constantly chewing on things, who are searching for oral input all the time. So what can we do? And again, as I've said numerous times, I don't really advise that anyone tries to work out their own child's sensory profile. I really do think you need to have someone who's trained in sensory integration to do that for you. There are certain things that obviously parents can do without that, trying to identify what the triggers are for certain behaviours. It often helps to keep a diary, and keep that diary even though meltdowns or difficult situations are not happening, because sensory overload occurs throughout the day. It also occurs day after day after day. So you might have a child who appears fine for days, appears fine at school, but melts down at home. And it might not be that thing that seemed to push them over their edge, their sibling touching them, or just going into the grocery store. It might not actually be that one thing. It is usually a buildup of sensory stimulation that just reaches an explosive point. And a lot of parents talk about the Coke bottle effect, and it's building up, building up, building up. And then that one little shake, that one last thing, just results in a huge sensory meltdown. Big things that can really, really help is have a plan. So make sure that your children are aware of what they're going to be doing. If you're need to go to the shops on the way home, try to build that into the daily plan and have them aware that that's something that you're going to do. Only parents know whether telling children too far in advance causes anxiety. So you have to make that decision for your own child, but planning in advance, having an escape plan that you're going to use if things get too much. Perhaps for some children, the older ones, music is really helpful, listening to certain music, having a certain toy, a fidget toy, having ear defenders with you, having a social story before you go. to the grocery store. It doesn't have to be just for a new situation, because it could be something that you go over many times. I think when children know that there is an escape, and working with children to help them identify, this is getting too much for me, encouraging them to tell you, and being able to say, okay, we're going to the grocery store, you tell me when it's starting to feel too much, and we will leave. And actually being able to do that, so they know they're safe and they know that there is an escape, helps them to try going into that situation again. It's sometimes just completely impractical, because sometimes you have to do things and you can't plan around that for kids. But practicing doing it on a day when you know you don't really have to get anything, and going at a time when you know the grocery store might be less busy, or you know you have to do something but you can do it at a less busy time, is often helps children to feel more confident to go into that the next time. Practicing opportunities, providing opportunities for sensory input. So before you go into that grocery store or the post office or whatever it is that you need to do, or perhaps before school, having a few things that provide deep proprioceptive input for your child, and helping them to know what they can do, even in a discreet manner, like push-ups on their chair, or pressing their palms together, or having a fidget toy before the sensory input becomes overwhelming for them. Sensory diets. Most people know about sensory diets, so implementing specific sensory activities throughout the day. And again, one of my biggest gripes is a sheet of activities just being handed to a school. The sensory diet at times can be implemented at certain times throughout the day, but I really would encourage anyone to make sure that their therapist is working with the school and looking at what happens on a Monday, what happens on a Tuesday, every single day of the week. Okay, music. We know music is a really difficult class for this child to attend. So that's when you need to implement some sensory activities. It's not something that you can say, do it every 2 hours or do it every this time throughout the day, because the timetable for the day changes every day of the week. And there's certain classes where actually they're fine, they don't need it. But there's certain classes where they absolutely must have some of these activities before they go in there. And it's really important. I can't bear it when I see sensory diets being handed down from child to child because the school just hasn't had that information for that particular child. Everybody's sensory system is individual, and every sensory diet must be written for that individual child. What works for one person might not work for somebody else. Someone who's presenting with seeking behaviours might also be a child who's really sensitive, but actually presenting with behaviours that show they're overwhelmed by the same input. So working out that specific sensory profile and monitoring it, because it changes. One thing that works one day might not work the next day. So this is also why it's really important that when you've got sensory input for your children, whether it's a therapist going into school or you've got it in your EHCP, that it's monitored. You can't just go in once a term and check on it. It needs to be far more regular to make sure that it's actually working. There's a number of environmental supports. Now, we're not going to change a person's responses to sensory input quickly. It's not a quick fix, and sensory integration therapy itself is not something that will happen really, really quickly. So we need to make environmental supports, and we need schools to be aware that this is all about accessibility. Sensory difficulties are in so much of the population, and putting these environmental supports in are really, really important for everybody. And it just makes an even playing field for everybody. So again, having really consistent organization, making sure that it's predictable and structured and the kids know what's going to happen. Having visual supports like a visual timetable or a visual social story, so that if this child is finding it really hard to take everything in at that point in time, they've got that visual support to look at, to know this is what's going to happen, and I know that I can go to a safe place. Having that safe place available, whether schools are quite limited on space, but whether it's a room that they can go to, that they can just escape the classroom, or that they can go outside and walk around for a little while. At home, I think that a lot of children with sensory difficulties come home in a really dysregulated state. And as a parent, our first instinct is to want to ask how their day was, what did you do, who did you play with? You know, all of this information's just adding onto the sensory overload that they've already got from the school day. So trying to resist adding to all of that, trying to not ask these sorts of questions, having an area at home where they can go to, and it doesn't need to be, you know, their own bedroom if that's something that's not possible to provide, but a little tent. And you can even get the very small cocoon chairs from IKEA for younger children, having somewhere they can just isolate. Maybe they need some very dim lighting in there, just some dim fairy lights, but something, you know, that they need, that they find helps. Some children will say, I need to swing. Having a bar within the home environment in a doorway, if you don't have outside access, having something outside, even a small monkey bar or a trampette or something. And kids will very often know what they need if they're supported to identify these sorts of things. In classrooms, I think that the first thing that teachers and parents probably as well think is put them at the front. Take away all the distraction in front of them. And for some children that really does work, and that's what they need. But actually some kids really hate being at the front because they can't see what's behind them, and that makes them feel even less secure. There's a lot of kids I work with who want to sit right at the side of the classroom. They like to have that wall next to them. They'll often lean against it and get some proprioceptive input. Others need to sit right near the door. They need to know I can leave when I need to leave. Having a card that they can show, or that understanding that they're allowed to leave when they need to, as really important classroom environmental supports. When implementing environmental supports, things that tend to benefit all children with sensory processing difficulties are more visual supports. Being able to even color coding a timetable, allowing them to have a watch or using a timer so they know when that activity is going to end. For children who can read written directions, even writing down rules or having it somewhere in the classroom where kids can be prompted to remember the rules about, if you need a break, you need to ask, or when the teacher's talking, we need to listen. Sometimes I actually need to see it rather than being verbally reminded of what they have to do. Proactively scheduling the sensory activities throughout the day. So I did speak about this earlier. It's not about doing a sensory activity every 2 hours or so often throughout the day. It's about knowing when to utilize those activities. And also it's about observing the child's behavior and actually having to react with a sensory activity for them, or helping them to identify that they need it. So we talk about the power sensors that you can use throughout the day to implement sensory activities and to help with attention and regulation. So the power sensors are the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, and the tactile system. And these are the three sensory systems that provide changes quickly. So using these sensory systems are the three that we generally go to when we need to implement sensory activities for children in a reactive sense. When we're doing something proactively, when we're filling their bucket, so to speak, the vestibular system generally has a lasting impact of around about 2 hours. For different children, it is going to differ, but you know that if you're going to use the vestibular and proprioceptive activities, you can generally have a longer lasting impact. What people can do to help children with their sensory regulation, as parents or people working in a classroom, it's really important to give the child the autonomy and the control over themselves. Not having that is what actually increases anxiety and increases their dysregulation or their primitive fight or flight type responses. So I see a lot of tapping to get a child's attention. I think that people are now more aware, but trying to get a child to look at them. A lot of kids don't look in your face when you're talking because there's actually too much visual information and they can't hear and respond to the auditory information. So trying to tell a child or prompt a child to look at you while you're speaking, it's actually not helpful for them. Some children, especially those with auditory processing difficulties, need time to process instructions. And asking a question and then prompting 2 seconds later can actually be just add to their overstimulation and add to the confusion because they're processing the information. And very often it can feel like a really long time, but if you give a child the time to answer the question or to follow the instruction, then they will do it without having that constant prompting and actually leading to more of a meltdown. Using deep pressure touch for children can really help to calm and regulate, making sure that you stay on schedule, pacing your language as well as waiting, not speaking too quickly, and using concrete language. So for some children, the instructions that they're receiving just have far too many words in them. Just use the words that you need to in order to help them with their processing. Some activities for the tactile sense for children who are undersensitive, using shaving cream or Play-Doh or finger painting, hair gel, which is actually something that is quite thick and quite sticky, and most people don't particularly like to have it on their hands. Kids who are undersensitive, actually, it can be really, really helpful to get all of that input into the system. They might need that extra tactile stimulation. Using, if you've got access to things like a ball pit or blankets or mats, there's certain vests that you can buy, and these are more so for the children who are undersensitive and need more input. Massage, and also that obviously depends on the environment that they're in, but even hand massage or foot massage. Vibrations are really good tactile input for some children. Some are going to absolutely hate it, but some really, really like it. And it just helps them to feel calmer and more regulated. there's lots of things, and sometimes it's hard for parents or therapists to help schools implement things like fidget toys. What I find is the kids who really need the fidget toys are not the kids who end up throwing it around the room or using it as a missile. You know, they actually use it as they're intended to be used. Blue tack's really, really common one, and actually a really good one because it can be very discreet. Using something like a weighted blanket or a weighted lap pad can be really effective for some children, just to help provide that calming and organizing. It's a great one to try at home with when doing homework. And if you're finding that it's really helpful for your child, you offering that as a resource to the teaching staff. Pencil grips for kids who have poor discrimination, who might need something bigger. Very often kids who have poor discrimination have weak intrinsic hand strength. So having a bigger pencil grip can be quite helpful for them. Kids who hold the pencil really tightly, using a more squishy pencil grip can often reduce the pain that they feel when they're holding that pencil so tightly. But you need to be careful, because the children who want the sensory input in a certain way may actually become overwhelmed. So again, you know, it's about having a therapist and having staff who are trained properly, and parents who receive the training from a therapist to monitor the input that they're receiving, to avoid it becoming something that's actually just not helping at all. When you're choosing the clothing, a lot of the time there might be a uniform that children have to wear to school, and the flexibility depends on the school, but you know, we have succeeded a lot of times in having it either written into an EHCP, or just by really providing the training to the school that they may need some accommodations in terms of that particular uniform. The formal uniform might be irritating, whereas the sports uniform might be less irritating. So it might be actually something they're willing to wear. You know, is it too tight? Is it too loose? Some kids like it really, really tight. Some like it really, really loose. So really allowing children to have that control over what they're wearing can prevent them from actually being irritated the entire day. Allowing the kids the time the night before, if they don't have a school uniform, to choose what they're going to wear the next day can reduce that overwhelming feeling in the morning where they're trying to choose something, or perhaps it's the weekend and you want to go out and do something. Starting the day off by having a stressful situation in choosing what you're going to wear, it just doesn't set kids up well for the day, you know, with their family or in school. So taking away that stress the night before can really help put the day off to a better start. Things that you can buy, like the body sock, is fantastic. You know, some children absolutely love these. They provide heaps of tactile input. They also help to provide proprioceptive input. And this is something that some kids I know come home and just hop inside. They love it. This is where they want to be. Helps them to regulate, de-stress, provides that calming input, and then they're ready for the afternoon, whatever they're going to be doing. Using the vestibular sense for calming and regulating information. Again, kids who are very, very sensitive to movement, you can use all of these things, but in a very gradual manner, very slow manner, to help their sensory system to regulate to it. The best thing, and one of the key points for sensory integration therapy itself, is for it to be child-led. If the children are going to use this type of equipment, then they will do it at their pace. Some children need support to use the equipment, and I would never go in fast or strong, or it would always be very slow, building up to what they can tolerate. Some children cannot wait to use this kind of equipment, and I see them, they come into the clinic and they're almost bouncing off the walls, and that's when you need to take them back and give them the calming and organizing type input that will help them explore movement in a more controlled manner. Very often children present as having really good motor skills because they move so fast, or really good balance, but they'll go on the monkey bars, they'll climb anything. But actually, when you slow them down and you're really testing all these areas, you can see that actually, unless they're moving in a really fast manner, they don't have very good coordination. So just looking at things in a more analytical or therapeutic manner can help to identify that sensory profile for your child. When we're looking at the movements, very linear movements, calm movements, and slow movements are really good for the sensory seeker and for the sensory avoider, and also when the children have gone beyond those thresholds and are now overwhelmed. So being able to identify those different profiles that I was talking about earlier can help us to know what type of movement or what kind of sensory input they need. For children who are very under-responsive to vestibular input, this is the times when it's good to use spinning or vertical movement. For children who perhaps don't like to spin, they may need to have spinning, but you're going to again do it in a very cautious manner so that they're not frightened or they're not overwhelmed, but they are getting some of that vestibular movement into their brain to help start building those neural pathways and those connections. In school, especially, using strategies where a child who perhaps needs movement or perhaps needs more calm movement. I have a lot of teachers who have a pile of books ready, and when they can see the child needs to have a break from the classroom or movement in a certain way, they're asked to deliver the books or the package to the front desk. And everyone's aware that this is when this child brings this stack of books, it's because they need a movement break. There's a lot of specialist schools that I work with who have gym equipment or outdoor movement equipment that children go out to use, which can provide that feedback for them. And again, the movement breaks proactively scheduled throughout the day to avoid children getting to a state where they are overstimulated. Things that you can implement for the proprioceptive sense in school, using things like the mini trampettes, having crash pads. And again, you need to be able to implement these strategies in a regulating way. So again, this is where the therapists come in who can work with you, doing wall push-ups when you want to have a break, or you can see a child needs a break, or perhaps they ask for it, which is even better. Using the weighted blankets, a lap pad in therapy sessions or during an actual sensory circuit, using a scooter board or a therapy ball, wheelbarrow walks. But again, anything that a child is initiating and a child is doing, so something like using monkey bars, which they're regulating the amount of proprioceptive input, is far more effective than giving it to a child. Using activities to help regulation in the auditory sense, so using things like, could be soft music or a soft voice, a quiet room and white noise for children who are oversensitive to auditory information, or using stimulating things such as loud or upbeat music, maybe needing to raise your voice, maybe having music playing in the background. There's a number of therapeutic listening programs that children do use, and the therapeutic listening program that I use is, I found it to be quite amazing when you have a child who's overstimulated, and when they are given the autonomy to learn what pieces of music they can use to help with regulation or to help with their anxiety. You know, when children are old enough to use it themselves, perhaps to listen to it on the way to school or during a break time when they need to listen to certain types of music, then they're getting that autonomy and learning these skills for when they're older, when they leave school, when they don't have someone helping them decide what they need all the time. So when we're looking at the visual sense, certain strategies which I spoke about when we were doing the information about visual processing, not having too many things in the background for the children who are actually noticing every single visual cue. Some children like to have very dim settings. They need to have their desk or their bedrooms to be really uncluttered so they can go there as a place that is calming and organizing for them. Using visual schedules, having something visual to refer to is really, really helpful. But for some kids who need to be a little bit alerted, using brighter colors or more stimulating environments. Those are just a range of strategies that parents and schools can use. But again, it's really important to have someone who is qualified to actually help identify the sensory profile of your child. There's a couple of references at the end here that are very helpful. In particular, the Carol Stock-Kranovitz, which is The Out of Sync Child, is a really helpful book for parents to read to understand different sensory profiles. There's another one that I don't think is actually on there. It's called The Sensational Child. And that is Lucy Jane Miller, which is a really good book. Again, it's very parent friendly.
Well, thanks so much for that, Melinda. Fantastic as always, really informative for me as well as the listeners. I'm sure always learn lots at these webinars. If it's okay, we've actually got some questions that we've taken from parents over the last week or so. I think some of it you've actually covered in your slides, but it's always helpful for parents to have it applied to their specific situation. And actually, I'm going to start with something that I don't think you covered today, and that's masking. So we've had a question in, or a scenario, if you like. So this parent is seeing lots of behaviours and dysregulation at home, but when they're going then to discuss this with the school are saying they aren't seeing that, and that this is something that's isolated, if you like, in the home environment, and they've heard about masking, and just wondered at any advice or information you can give around that.
Okay, yeah, masking is becoming something that people are more aware of, and it's absolutely huge. So you know, it's something that could probably have its own topic of presentation, but this happens all the time, that schools are saying we don't see this in school. We know that children mask. We know that it's very, very common in girls, and it's one of the major reasons why girls have not been diagnosed with autism as often as boys. Although it's not to say that boys don't mask, because a lot actually do. So in terms of sensory difficulties, children, especially children who have a higher understanding of what is socially expected of them, or perhaps they've been reprimanded so many times that they know these behaviors they display are undesirable, but they need them to regulate. And that's the whole thing about sensory processing. All of these behaviors that we see, children need to regulate their systems. So when they're masking, they're putting on what is, they feel, is the expected front and the expected appearance. So they're always trying to look neurotypical, but you can only do this for so long, and it's exhausting. It leads to a lot of trauma. In my experience, I really do believe that masking leads to mental health issues, especially when you have added difficulties like social communication difficulties on top of sensory. But what we see so often is school doesn't see the behaviours, but home does. And really, that happens for a lot of children because home's a safe place, isn't it? Home is where children can decompress, where their behaviour, they've held it in for so long throughout the school day, and it is that Coke bottle effect. They come home and it just all comes out. I think it's really dangerous for children to mask. And like I said, it's a huge contributor to mental health issues later in life. It's acting like a person that you're not. So it's absolutely exhausting. And it's something that we need to educate schools about more, because this is a conversation that we're having all the time. That's also why it's really important when you're working with kids or someone's working with your child to analyze sensory profiles in the school environment and in the home environment, and as much as possible to actually ensure that the therapist has seen your child. A lot of therapists perhaps work in one environment or the other, but even sending videos or doing a Zoom observation of kids at home having the meltdowns can be really, really helpful to identify the sensory profile. So yeah, I'm really pleased to hear that masking is a very big topic at the moment and something we really need to educate people on.
Absolutely, and lots of really practical advice there as well, which is always really good, Melinda. I have a question here. It's sort of very multifaceted from Louise. She's asking for recommendations, any recommendations you might give to support a child during haircuts, to wear a coat without having the sleeves rolled up, without needing to cover buttons, not needing a fan on all night, etc. And also reasonable adjustments you might be making or recommending to schools to help with fidgeting, movement breaks, seating aids, sensory diet, etc. So quite a big question.
Yeah, okay. So there's some things that actually, why is it a problem? That I think, say having a fan on at night. I do know lots of kids that like to have a fan on at night, and I don't think that that's an issue, actually. If it's the feeling of the fan or the noise that is helping them to sleep, then actually that's really, really important, because sleep is absolutely fundamental to all of our health and all of our mental health. But for kids especially who are going through a really, it's an effortful day, it's really overwhelming, switching off and actually getting sleep is just so important. So, you know, if your child needs a fan on at night, then I don't see why that actually is an issue. I can see that going to a sleepover, maybe that, if they need to have their fan. But, you know, I would not send my child somewhere if the parents were going to say, well, no, they can't have a fan. You know, I wouldn't feel that they're in an environment that's safe for them. So, you know, something like that, I think we need to change the environment, not the child, actually, in a lot of these things. Having a haircut, now that's probably something you can't really change for a lot of kids, and you know that these things need to happen. Wearing a coat can be traumatic for some kids. So I'm looking at the question on my screen as well here. Having to cope with, you know, buttons, things like that. Now, this is where the sensory strategies for deep pressure, calming, organizing input is really important. And again, you need to have the therapist to identify your child's individual sensory profile. Some kids have to wear a vest so they don't feel that irritation of the buttons or a zipper on their clothing. Some kids, you know, I have one myself who just almost refuses to wear a coat unless it is literally snowing. It's unless it's detrimental to their health, there's some things we actually just need to let go of our preconceived ideas about. But most often, if you are going to have to go and do something that you know is going to be difficult, it's really the proprioceptive and vestibular input that you need to be implementing prior to that. But I can't really give advice on specific things because you need to analyze the sensory profile as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks for that answer. We've had quite a lot of questions in, and there is a common theme, as is so often the case when you ask the questions. And that is several parents have raised that their CCG or local authority instructed occupational therapist actually doesn't cover any form of sensory integration assessment as part of their assessment, or will point blank refuse to consider it if they are asked to do so by parents. Obviously, we see that as lawyers as much as you do as an occupational therapist, I'm sure. Is there any advice or any understanding reasoning that you can give from your perspective as an occupational therapist as to why that might be happening? I know I have my views as a solicitor, but we're not here to hear these today.
Okay. So I know one of the questions somebody asked was, is it a legal, what is it? Is it legally recognized as a need? So first of all, on that one, I don't think there's any legal, yes or no that anyone can refer to, me or a therapist who doesn't agree with it. So no, there's no legal stance there on SI. What has happened over the last few years, I think, as the resources are very stretched. The sensory side of things I find very confusing because I've worked in a number of NHS services and we've all used sensory strategies, and the ones I've worked in have all had suspension equipment and sensory rooms. What parents need to be very aware of is sensory integration therapy is a very, very specific type of therapy. You will be very unlikely to find anyone who only does SI. There's a lot of fidelity measures that you have to adhere to. You need to have a room of a certain size, suspension equipment with a certain number of points, and it's very, very strict. So there's very few therapists who actually just do pure SI. You tend to find it in the States more than you find it here. So when you're asking for sensory integration therapy, I don't recommend sensory integration therapy when I'm doing recommendations for a plan. It's very, very rare. That's not actually what you're really wanting. What you're wanting is an assessment of the child's sensory profile and things like a sensory diet, but you want it to be implemented by trained staff and you want it to be monitored. So in terms of actual sensory integration therapy, it's almost impossible to do it in a school unless you have the room and the equipment within the school. I don't know exactly why. A lot of the local authorities are challenging it because there is a lot of information and there is a lot of research evidence to show that it works. One of the really difficult aspects of research around sensory integration is that I said earlier in my presentation, no two children's profiles are the same. So in terms of doing a huge randomized control study, it's so difficult to do because we can't get all of these children and implement the same therapy and see the same results. They're all going to be different. a few years ago, a research article came out about sensory integration therapy and direct therapy being ineffective. There's a lot of criticism about this article. There is a lot of reasons that it was not accepted by many OTs, but I do find that the local authorities are using this research article to try and reduce the amount of therapy that a child needs. I think it's really important that all of us work on an evidence-based model of therapy, but for me, that means looking at all different resources, but most importantly, working out what is right for that particular child, because every child is different. So I don't know why it is actually not accepted, but it's probably a lot to do with resources being available to implement the therapy.
Yeah, so I'd share that view. I think it comes down to resources as well.
Yeah.
It kind of picks up on one of the things you mentioned in that last question, actually, and the need actually for these kinds of strategies to be implemented by trained people. Mila, sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, has asked actually, can parents deliver sensory strategies? Or is there any specific training required?
Yeah, so absolutely, parents can deliver sensory strategies. There's no point in just doing a sensory integration, even if it's pure SI, in the right clinic once a week for an hour. It's not going to make a difference. What we really need is parents to be trained to implement these strategies and staff within schools to be trained. It's almost a 24-hour process that children's sensory processing doesn't shut off and stop at certain times of the day. So absolutely, but again, you just need a trained therapist to analyze the profile and to work out what strategies you can use, and for it to be monitored, not to hand over a list of activities and walk away, but it to be monitored on a regular basis.
I just want to give you a plug in there, actually, thinking of it. It's just sprung to my mind, Melinda, that during the lockdown, I think you actually did a webinar for parents that talked about some of the things, the activities that they can actually do at home. And that is available on the SEN Legal YouTube. So Mila, if you want to go and find that, there are some activities there that Melinda modelled for parents during lockdown when they weren't accessing therapies and education that you could do at home, which might be helpful for you. I have a question here from Marina, or a scenario if you like. So her daughter is mouthing lots and lots of things, non-food items at nursery, and that is becoming a problem. Nursery are saying she's not allowed to do that. Do you have any suggestions that they could implement as an alternative or to help?
Yeah, obviously it can become a safety risk when children are mouthing. In terms of behaviours like that, what we're trying to do is replace them with things that are more appropriate. So getting something like a water bottle to drink out of, I find ones with straws with a bit thicker diameter are really good because they're quite hard to suck, and that provides some oral feedback. Using sometimes the ones that have the pop-up bit that you suck out of are also quite good. If your chewy toys, chewy jewelry, the necklaces that children can use, or the bracelets are often quite good. And giving children things like carrots to chew on, as long as they've got the oral motor skills for something that hard. Popcorn, I've got a real chewer. We tend to put popcorn in her lunch, and that really, it can also help with the anxiety, giving back that organizing and calming input. So I think in terms of chewing, it is about trying to replace it with a safer behavior, and finding things that they can chew on or suck or use.
rather than trying to remove the behaviour altogether.
Yeah, because it's a need, and that's what people need to think about sensory processing as. It's a need, and we're all different, and that's why I don't advocate changing the child. You know, if actually something I think I didn't quite cover in a previous question, accommodations that can be put into school. Mm-hmm. If a child needs something and we can implement it in a way that's safe for them and safe for other children, then I think it all comes down to disability discrimination. Actually, if there's an accommodation a child needs, then it needs to be put in, and because that helps to regulate them, put them in a calm state for learning, it absolutely must be put into the school day. Without it, if they can't access learning, then it is discrimination.
Absolutely. I mean, that feeds really nicely actually into a question that we've received from Donna. So she asked for things that you can do to help children with sensory overload in a scenario where the environment can't be changed. But I think following on from what you've just said, and it's an opinion I share, very often there are accommodations that can be made. It's just a case of making that, you know, those changes and those accommodations be put into place by a school. Because there are lots of things that can be done to change the environment, even if it seems insurmountable. There are things that can be done. And Donna actually did have a specific question, sort of following on from Marina. It's about teeth brushing. So they're having real difficulties with toothbrushing. They've never been able to do it. Is there anything specific for toothbrushing that you could maybe signpost them to?
Again, toothbrushing, the oral sensitivity, what we are generally looking at is providing more calming input around the mouth. Some children, that can be achieved by chewing or massage or compression. Some children, it can actually be vibration that really helps them to tolerate that input in the mouth. So it's really personalized to the child. If the parents can try doing deep pressure, calming and organizing. Now that's, some sensory input can have adverse effects, but it would be highly unlikely that giving a child deep pressure around the jaw and then trying to do teeth brushing is going to have an adverse effect. Something like vibration might. So I don't want to say try vibration, because actually it could really dysregulate someone if it's not right. So again, it really is about getting a therapist to analyze your child's sensory profile. And I know that's really frustrating for parents, but I've seen so many children over the years that I know it's different for almost every child. There isn't you know, an ingredients list or a recipe that you can follow. You really need to work out what's right for your child.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think you've covered all of the questions that we received there really nicely, actually, Melinda. It's great to get some practical advice like that, because we know it's really helpful for parents based on the feedback that we've had. So thank you so much for your time, for your presentation, meticulously set out as ever. And I'm sure that it's going to go on to help a lot of people, and it'll certainly help us. Always great to see, you know, the latest guidance and things as well. So that is it for Melinda. I will let her go and enjoy her evening, and we will be back for the next segment of our webinar series on Tuesday the 9th, when I will be talking about the transition from child to adult social care. So I'm hoping to see you all there. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.